Hello, and welcome back to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast. Lisa Woll, CEO of the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment and the US SIF Foundation, will be sharing with us today about the mindset around and ways to build an outstanding nonprofit board.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, where your host, KIRSTEN Bullock, interviews nonprofit CEOs and executive directors who share what's working. Show notes can be found at nonprofitleadersnetwork.com. Please add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Now, let's get on with the show.
Thank you, Lisa, for joining us today.
Thank you, Kirsten. Happy to be doing so.
Lisa has been the CEO of the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment and the US SIF Foundation since 2006. Prior to that, Lisa served in various capacities with organizations including International Women's Media Foundation, Save the Children, Suited for Change, Women's Voices for the Earth, the Children's Environmental Health Network, and Advantage Ethiopia. She's received numerous awards, including Washingtonian of the Year in 2001, and has volunteered on other nonprofit boards and commissions. You can read her full bio on the podcast page. Lisa, to kick us off, could you share a few words about the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment?
Certainly. US SIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment, is the organization in the U.S. advancing sustainable, responsible, and impact investing, which simply means how do you use your investments to both make a financial return and to drive environmental and social issues forward. We have approximately 300 members managing or owning $3 trillion in assets, and it ranges from big financial services firms to original sustainable investment firms, research providers, community investing institutions, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and pension funds. So quite a broad and interesting membership and group of people.
It sounds like it. And for the nonprofits who are members, are those typically larger entities, or is it entities of all sizes?
It depends. They're definitely a small part of our membership, but increasingly nonprofits see the financial system as a way to make impact. So they might work, for example, with some investors to bring a shareholder resolution on an issue they're concerned about at a publicly traded company. And so they're increasingly interested in kind of the financial system as another way for them to strategically move issues forward. And they range from what I'd call sort of medium to larger size institutions. Most really small institutions wouldn't have the bandwidth for this.
Right. And I would imagine that this is a really complex kind of issue to be trying to address. Do you find it difficult to explain to your board what it is you're doing and how you're accomplishing it, or is that fairly easy?
No, because we're a membership group, so my board by bylaws has to come from the membership. So I would hope they definitely know what we're doing. I think the reality is where you might have sometimes a need to kind of explain more is that most of our members are in the for-profit world, and most of them at much larger institutions than US SIF. And as a nonprofit, we are different than a for-profit company. We have different management. We have different kinds of priorities. And so that's where sometimes there needs to be more conversation about kind of how a nonprofit and a for-profit may be different for folks who are new to boards. But our board is entirely coming from the membership, so there is definitely a strong knowledge about this space and this work.
Right. So being that they're all members, does that make board recruitment a little easier for you, do you think?
I think it actually is both a plus and a minus. And that is, someone who's run a nonprofit, I've run another membership group I've been a board chair of, and I've either run or been on boards of non-membership groups. With non-membership groups, you simply have a wider array of the community that you can choose from because you're not limited by membership. And with membership, in some ways, it makes it easier because you're slightly more limited in who you can choose, but you're also limited by who do you see at an event. So, for example, with us, I might have a member firm that has 16,000 employees, but I may see 5 of them ever. because those are the folks who are involved with us. So I can see only a small percentage of the kinds of people working at a particular firm. So even there, I'm not getting a full picture of where there might be opportunities. So I would say it's a pro in the sense that you have a sense of where folks are coming from and what they might be committed to. It's a con in that it's just a more limited universe.
And you talk about board management being more art than science.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
It's funny, when you read about recruiting board members, oftentimes what you'll read is you need to look at areas where you need help. You need to look at areas where there may be gaps, and so maybe you need someone who knows something about accounting, or someone who knows legal issues, or someone who can help with fundraising. And all of those are in their own ways incredibly useful pieces of information. What I have found in years and years of either running boards or sitting on boards or being on staff and working with boards is that what makes a good board member oftentimes is not something that fits very well on a graph, and they tend to be folks who just really will quickly get involved, will be supportive and engaged, and a partner. And oftentimes those characteristics are not something that's knowable unless you've gotten to know the person. What we try to do here is before we slate anybody to run for the board, we generally like somebody to be already involved in our activities. So in many ways, we pull from the volunteer pool because we already know that somebody is engaged. We already have a sense of their working style. We already have a sense of if they say they do something, will they actually do it? We've seen them been involved in sort of public speaking or interaction. And the same with the non-membership boards that I've been on. You know, oftentimes we will recruit board members from volunteer pools. And that could be anything from a worker bee to somebody more high profile who's helped us raise money, so that we're not getting a person who on the surface looks great, but we really don't have a sense of from a personal level. And I think that's critical, because what makes a good board member is oftentimes an amalgamation of personal and professional characteristics that don't easily fit into a kind of grid. That being said, a grid is helpful for letting you know the kinds of things you want to talk to a potential board member about, but not necessarily whether you should be recruiting that person.
Absolutely. And then once you've got them on the team, what do you do to get people on board as far as getting them up to speed on the organization and what the board is doing?
Right. So I want to, at this point, really bring in the notion of who your board chair is a critical component to how successful you're going to be. And because I've sat on both ends of this sort of spectrum, I really do believe that the best organizations, not necessarily the largest, but the ones that function in the sort of the most productive way with the best chances of success, have both a really, really great CEO or executive director and a really great board chair. As with any new staff member or board member, you're probably much more effective your second year than your first year, where you're really learning and absorbing. I think for people who are big joiners who get on the board and quickly get involved and spend time and come visit the office and talk to other staff, I think it's easier for them to get a sense of the organization more quickly. I think, our job here, board chair and CEO, is to give people the kind of framework for them to be effective. And then a big part of how effective they are is how willing they are to engage. And I think the more people are engaged, the more they learn and the more effective they are as board members.
Absolutely. Now, was this process in place when you started with the organization, or is this something that you instituted?
It has been a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
When I came, our bylaws were very different as it related to election. It was a much more free-flowing process, and over time we have refined it so that we could more effectively marry the qualities we needed for this organization to grow and to move in its strategic direction with our process for the board. And so we changed the bylaws around board recruitment probably more than any other part of the bylaws. And we've changed the process, and we actually just made, after our last strategic plan, decided to downsize the board. And so it's definitely been an evolution over time, but it's been very responsive at each moment to sort of where we were as an institution and where we wanted to go. I also think that as a membership organization, we've recognized that there may be some expertise that we want that exists outside of our membership. And so one of the things we've talked about over time is how you create an advisory council that would not have a fiduciary role, but could be a kind of additional set of eyes and ears to help us develop. And I've done that in other organizations. I started an organization called Suited for Change, which was helping low-income women enter the workforce when I was 29, and the entire board was under 40. And that was great because it gave leadership opportunities to a whole bunch of women, young women, 20s and 30s, who never would have gotten it. The average age of a board in D.C. I'd put in the 40s to early 60s. The downside of that is that most of these women were quite unconnected, both to women who had power in their positions, but also women who had access to money. And we created an advisory council probably around year 4 of media personalities and multiple other sort of high-level folks in Washington, D.C. And I would say that about year 8 of Suited for Change, what we realized is we were far enough in our advancement to collapse the board and the advisory council together. But I always encourage people who have the capacity to run 2 kinds of boards like this. You know, it's double the work. To think about an advisory council when they might feel that their board and the structure that they have, while serving one purpose, may not be serving all the purposes they need. So just to be creative and think broadly about how you can accomplish your goals. And sometimes you can't accomplish all your goals through a board and staff, no matter how great they both are.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the time issue around getting the board functioning well and investing the time. And in your case, you had 2 different entities that you were trying to build up. What kinds of things take the time, and what kinds of things do you think are tempting to spend time on that maybe you don't need to?
I think this is where I think the role of the executive committee is really important. So one of the things that I think is really important is that this is not seen as a CEO responsibility 100%, that the executive committee shares in that. We have encouraged board chairs and executive committee members to reach out to board members at least once a year, talk to them about how their board experience is going. It is the role of the board to build the board. It is the role of the CEO to make sure that the tools are there. But I think CEOs put themselves in an overworked and precarious place when they feel that the success of the board is dependent on them. The success of the board is dependent on the institution, which includes board leadership. And any board chair worth his or her salt needs to understand that the development of the board, the sense of inclusion and engagement of the board is as much a responsibility of the board chair and by extension executive committee members as it is the CEO. And so I think those are really important conversations for any executive director to have with a potential incoming board chair, is to understand how he or she thinks about that.
And in the process of developing this, what would you say was one of your biggest successes?
In terms of developing?
In terms of developing the board.
I just love the opportunity to take a bunch of young women who had never been on a board before and see them develop. And that was something that I did at Suited for Change, but I've done that multiple times in other boards that I've had an opportunity to work with, because oftentimes what I've learned is you can't really look at somebody in their first year of board experience and think that that's what they're going to be like after 3 years or 6 years. Because what I've seen are people who've come onto boards and have been very, very cautious, a little bit conservative, and not politically conservative, but conservative in sort of how they thought about their role on the board, who, as they gain more experience and as they gain more confidence in their role as a board member, oftentimes people, just as their first board that they've been on, they really become breakout stars. And so I often believe that, you need to help people find a path to be effective. And once they do that, they really learn how great it can be to be on a board. And that's true for 20-year-olds. It's true for women and men who I've seen come on board who are fairly high profile but have never been on a board before. And they really learn through the experience and really grow with it. And so I often tell folks that no matter how good somebody is when they start, they can be so much better 3 or 5 years down the road if you work with them and mentor them and give them the tools to help them be effective.
That sounds like a very exciting experience. And the flip side to that, have you ever gone into something and made some decisions that didn't work out so well? Maybe an opportunity or a challenge. Some people might call that a failure. Do you have an experience where things didn't go so well?
Oftentimes when making decisions about hiring, you always have to think about what's your gut reaction. And, in a 20-plus year career, I think there have been moments in hiring where, and I'm not talking specifically about this job, I'm talking about overall, where someone has responded in a particular way and it sends a note of concern in your head. And what I have learned is that generally if it sends a note of concern in your head during an interview, you probably should take a step back from hiring that person. Mm-hmm. And I have learned to rely on my gut a lot. And even if others on staff who may be part of that interview process didn't hear it the same way, I have learned generally to not ignore that because people will give you information you should pay attention to sometimes.
That's great advice, Lisa. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to all our listeners for everything you do to make the world a better place.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast with Kirsten Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll check out our prior episodes and that you'll pass along our web address, nonprofitleadersnetwork.com, to your friends and colleagues in the nonprofit sector.